It is my pleasure to introduce Chad Williams this evening. Chad Williams, when First Year Experience first came to us and said that they wanted to have a lecturer talk about race and the African American experience during World War I, Professor Williams was the first name that came to my mind. He is at the forefront, I think, of changing the narrative and discussing African American experience during World War I and military experience in many levels in general. And so we are pleased to have him here and that it was able to work it out. So, Chad Williams is an associate professor and chair of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies at Brandeis University. He was born and raised in San Francisco. Dr. Williams attended college at UCLA, where he earned a BA with honors in history and African American studies, and he received both his MA and PhD in history from Princeton University. He is widely recognized as an expert on African Americans in World War I, and more generally, African Americans and the military. His first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I Era, which is also the title for the talk, is widely praised as a landmark study. It won the 2011 Liberty Legacy Foundation Award from the Organization of American Historians, the 2011 Distinguished Book Award from the Society of Military History, and the distinction as a 2011 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. In the work, he shifts the discussion of African American involvement in World War I somewhat away from the tale of white racism or stories of heroic duty by blacks on the front line. For Williams, the war proclaimed by Woodrow Wilson as one to make the world safe for democracy, challenged and helped define African Americans' identity as Americans both at home and abroad. It is this challenge and African Americans' responses to it that is the heart of this groundbreaking work. Williams argues that during and after World War I, blacks, quote, engaged in a fierce struggle to infuse personal and collective meaning into the ideals and everyday realities of democracy. With that focus, he has opened the narrative of African American experience during the era to a broader discussion of the formulation of identity and claims to citizenship. Tonight, we will hear a bit about African American struggles for identity and citizenship, as well as how individuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois thought about the war in his lecture, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in World War I. Please help us welcome Dr. Chad Williams.
Thank you, Sean, for that very generous and thorough introduction. I didn't know I said all that stuff in my book. That's pretty impressive. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I've had a wonderful day on campus. I'm certainly feeling the KU love. It's a pleasure to be here, to be able to participate in this very important programming series, to engage with you around the ideas in the common book that you are reading. I want to first and foremost thank Howard Graham for the incredibly kind invitation and all of his incredible work for organizing this series, for planning my visit, for showing me around the campus. We were joking I couldn't go 5 minutes without someone, slapping him on the back or saying, "Hey, well, what's up, Howard?" I mean, he's the man around here, apparently, huh? So thank you very much for all of your hospitality. Certainly like to thank the Department of African and African Studies, the Langston Hughes Center for their support in bringing me here tonight. And again, thank all of you for being here, for engaging in the history of World War I in such a serious and sustained manner. Since the beginning of the World War I Centennial, I've been giving quite a bit of thought to why World War I matters. Why is it that the First World War, especially on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, is oftentimes treated as a forgotten war. Why does it seem to pale in comparison to the impact of World War II, to the trauma of the Vietnam War, to the romanticism of the Civil War? What changes did the war bring about? What are its legacies today? And even more specifically, for our purposes, what did the war mean for African Americans and other peoples of African descent? Now, I have no doubt if he were alive today, W.E.B. Du Bois would be asking these very questions and probably some additional ones. One of the founding figures of the modern civil rights movement and arguably the greatest black intellectual in American history, Du Bois occupies a central place in the history and legacy of World War I for African Americans. He not only lived through the war, recognizing it as a defining moment in his political and intellectual career, but also spent decades grappling with its troubling and at times confounding memory. A century later, we are still trying to understand, just like Du Bois, how best to tell the story of African Americans in the war and why that story matters. In July of 1918, W.E.B. Du Bois received a letter written by an unnamed African American who expressed his belief to Du Bois that black people, in spite of the challenges that they were facing at the time, had to support the American war effort, rally around the flag, and prove their worth on the battlefield. The writer very pointedly described black soldiers as torchbearers to make the world safe for democracy. Now, when I came across this letter, I have to admit, at the time, I was just so excited. I thought this sounded like a great title for a book. I was just hyped. This is perfect. This sounds so good. But I eventually took a step back and thought kind of long and hard about what that really meant, right? What it meant to characterize black soldiers as torchbearers of democracy. So in preparing for my talk this evening, reflecting on the significance of the Centennial and grappling with the meaning of our current racial moment, all these factors have again compelled me to revisit this question. Indeed, what lessons can we draw from the years of the First World War to perhaps better understand the meaning of democracy and struggles for racial justice today? President Woodrow Wilson famously asserted that the United States entered the war to make the world safe for democracy. When Wilson spoke these words, he tapped into a powerful political discourse, one that excited the imaginations of people from all types of backgrounds. Democracy was, and still is, a highly elusive term. It meant and continues to mean different things to different people. Throughout American history, democracy has been a work in progress. It has been deeply flawed, inconsistent, all too often blatantly contradictory. But it was something that African Americans staked claim to, insisted upon, and forcibly demanded. Moreover, African Americans reimagined just what democracy itself should be and worked to transform it into a reality that spoke to the individual and collective aspirations of black people for equal citizenship and, most importantly, recognition as human beings. African American soldiers and veterans stood on the front lines of this struggle. Some 380,000 black soldiers fought and labored in the United States Army during the war. Over 200,000 black servicemen traveled to France. 2 all-black divisions engaged in combat. Thousands of black troops received medals of commendation. After the war, African American veterans, both physically and symbolically, shaped what would come to be known as the New Negro movement. The experiences of African American soldiers and what they represented allows us to develop a deeper understanding of how the war fundamentally shaped the social, cultural, and political terrain of black life during the World War I era. W.E.B. Du Bois certainly knew this. Even more importantly, the history of black soldiers and veterans provides us with a powerful example of how African Americans, a century after the war, have and continue to fight for democracy today. Now, one of the questions that historians continue to wrestle with and endlessly debate is just what was the First World War about? Just what were the causes of this horrific maelstrom that would ultimately lead to over 17 million deaths? From the moment the guns erupted in August of 1914, W.B. Du Bois made the explicit connection between the World War and the broader African diaspora. In his first musings about the conflict, Du Bois warned African Americans against, quote, supposing that the present war is far removed from the color problem of America. He went further to argue that the cause of the war lay in, his words, the wild quest for imperial expansion among colored races between the rival European nations and the, quote, theory of the inferiority of the darker peoples that legitimize their actions. Du Bois would expand and put an even finer point on this argument in his essay entitled The African Roots of War, which appeared in the May 1915 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. He would write, yet, in a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization which we have lived to see. He could point to the use of African colonial subjects as both laborers and, in the case of France, their use of West African soldiers as well as North African soldiers on the Western Front as prime example, as prime evidence of his claim. Now, while Du Bois understood how the democratic meaning, significance of the war was connected to the broader context of Africa and its diaspora, most African Americans remain principally concerned with the crisis of democracy facing black people in the United States. Or indeed, it's crucial to not forget just how divorced democracy had become from the lives of most African Americans on the eve of World War I. Jim Crow segregation, political disenfranchisement, sharecropping, debt peonage, a horrific convict lease system, devastating racial violence. This was, as the pioneering African-American historian, who was also a World War I veteran, Rayford Logan, described as the nadir, one of the lowest points in the history of modern race relations in American history. So in April of 1917, when the United States finally entered the war, black people were, in effect, citizens in name only. But the ideals of democracy continued to resonate for African Americans. It remained a powerful aspiration, one rooted in a history of struggle dating back to the antebellum period, right? An aspiration that motivated movements for civil rights in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm giving a shout out to my colleague, Sean Alexander here. One of the earliest African American civil rights organizations, the National Afro-American Council meeting. This was in Minnesota in 1902. So this spark of democratic hope that black people could one day be seen and treated as full American citizens and equal participants in American democracy certainly remained very much alive in the years leading up to the war. So for that reason, perhaps Woodrow Wilson should have thought a little bit more carefully about his words that he spoke on the evening of April the 2nd, 1917, when he addressed Congress and issued a declaration of war against Germany. In his 36-minute speech, Wilson gave a truly memorable performance, asserting America's role in the war and its larger political vision, when he famously proclaimed, "The world must be made safe for democracy. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them." While remarkably effective in framing what the United States would be fighting for, his speech was also a double-edged sword. Women's rights activists, organized labor, and African Americans now approached this so-called war for democracy as a unique opportunity to improve their respective social, political, and economic conditions relative to American democracy. Perhaps more than any other group, African Americans seized upon the blatant hypocrisy of Woodrow Wilson's pledge and appropriated democracy as a rhetorical and ideological weapon in the cause of racial equality. But fighting for African American civil rights, while at the same time declaring the patriotic loyalty of the race, was a challenge made even more painful by incidents like the July 1917 East St. Louis massacre, in which dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of African Americans were brutally slaughtered in what could only best be described as a pogrom. W.E.B. Du Bois, he would later capture this tension, this dilemma, when he penned arguably the most controversial editorial of his career, entitled Close Ranks, which appeared in the July 1918 issue of The Crisis magazine, the Journal of News and Opinion of the NAACP, which he edited. And this is what he said, in part: "We of the colored race have no ordinary interest in the outcome. That which the German power represents today spells death to the aspirations of Negroes and all darker races for equality, freedom, and democracy. Let us not hesitate. Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills." The controversy that ensued around Close Ranks spoke to the fact that the warring ideals, as he would famously describe in The Souls of Black Folk, of being black and being American, that defined Du Bois's understanding of the double consciousness of African American identity, would not be easily reconciled in this war. Nevertheless, the majority of African Americans knew that democracy would have to be fought for. Racial progress would require black people to place their lives on the line. For this reason, military service, as the highest form of patriotism and civic obligation, and the specific role of African American soldiers, dominated both public and private debates about black participation in the war. And this is why memory is so important. Debates regarding the use of African American soldiers in the war revolved around competing historical memories of the meaning of black military service. On the one hand, you had African Americans drawing from the inspiring memories of black sacrifice in the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks, and especially the heroism of black soldiers in the Civil War, like the Massachusetts 54th Infantry Regiment, if any of you have seen Glory, okay? You know what I'm talking about. Conversely, many white Americans, particularly those in the South, feared the potential use of black soldiers in the war based on their own historical memories of black troops as specific threats to white supremacy. Black soldiers in the South, armed with guns, inspiring black people to assert their rights as American citizens. The worst nightmares of Southern whites became a reality on the night of August the 24th, 1917, in Houston, Texas. After enduring weeks of racial abuse from racist white citizens and police officers, a battalion of black soldiers of the 24th Infantry stationed at Camp Logan on the outskirts of the city struck back against their tormentors. Determined to enact retribution, for weeks of racial discrimination and abuse, over 100 soldiers took up arms, deserted camp, and with guns drawn, marched into downtown Houston. For 3 hours, black soldiers ignited the streets of Houston in a fury of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 2 black soldiers and 15 white men lay dead, including 4 white police officers. Military officials promptly placed the entire battalion under arrest and subsequently court-martialed them for their actions. After the first of 3 trials in which a total of 110 men were found guilty of mutiny, law enforcement hastily executed 13 soldiers, denying them the opportunity to appeal their judgment. A total of 19 black servicemen were ultimately hung, with 63 receiving life sentences in federal prison. So we see how these competing views of black soldiers literally clashed from the outset of American involvement in the war. Questions swirled if African Americans would be able to serve in the war, and if so, in what capacity. Now, the American Army needed soldiers. The War Department needed bodies. Realized that they did not simply have the luxury of excluding African Americans from service altogether, or severely complicating training procedures by restricting black soldiers from serving in Southern camps. So despite oftentimes intense Southern opposition, the enlistment and mobilization of black soldiers proceeded with the passage of the Selective Service Act in May of 1917. But this by no means meant that black soldiers were going to be treated equally. From the onset of the implementation of the draft, military officials and local administrators of the Selective Service system envisioned African Americans serving in an almost exclusively labor capacity. Approximately 80% of all the black men who served in the wartime army served as labor troops. One official bluntly described black troops as, quote, laborers in uniform. Of the 200,000 African American soldiers who served overseas in France, approximately 140,000 labored in the services of supply, loading and unloading ships, laying railroad tracks, digging ditches, salvaging battlefields, burying dead bodies, all the unglamorous, ugly work of the war, but still essential. If they had to serve, so reasoned many racist military officials at the time, black soldiers would serve in a capacity suited to their so-called natural capabilities, and in a role as laborers that they could be controlled. The fact that the vast majority of black soldiers carried shovels instead of rifles has, in my view, played a very important role in dismissing the historical contributions and legacies of black soldiers in the war. Why, according to some historians, the history has been lost. It's unknown or forgotten. But the fact is, not all black soldiers served in this capacity. The Army established two black combat divisions, the 92nd Division and the 93rd Division. The 92nd Division, composed of draftees, was really born out of political pressure from black leaders, civil rights activists who realized the importance of African American soldiers proving their worth on the battlefield to the larger cause of black civil rights. Although commanded at the highest ranks by white men, many of whom were deeply committed racists, the 92nd Division did contain black officers. The War Department agreed to create an all-black officers training camp, which opened on June 15th, 1917, in Des Moines, Iowa. All right? They wanted it kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Hope no one's from Iowa. Don't want to offend anybody. But they really wanted to keep it away from urban centers as much as possible. Also the fact that Iowa had more lax Jim Crow laws. So although this camp was segregated, which many African Americans at the time objected to, the Des Moines camp represented an important moment in the history of the war and African American military history more broadly. Right? The technical training the candidates received proved that black men had the mental ability to be quality officers, and from a symbolic perspective, the presence of African American officers in the Army subverted traditional social and military racial hierarchies by potentially empowering black men and oftentimes putting them in positions of authority over white soldiers. Right? This is why many white soldiers and other officers in particular were vehemently opposed to African Americans being commissioned as officers in the war. The 92nd Division, what Du Bois would later characterize as, in his words, the storm center concerning black combat troops, had a very trying experience. The various regiments of the division trained at separate facilities throughout the United States, preventing cohesiveness and a sense of collective identity. In France, black officers were targeted by efficiency boards, demeaned by their superiors, and plagued by vicious rumors that the men of the division, and as well as their officers, were guilty of numerous incidents of raping French women. The 92nd Division actually became known amongst many white soldiers and officers in the American Expeditionary Forces as the Raping Division. Completely unfounded, overblown. The second black fighting division, the 93rd Division, was composed mostly of National Guard units from New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Ohio, Maryland. The 93rd Division saw extensive combat duty in France, and this was primarily due to the fact that it actually served with the French Army, was the only American combat division to serve exclusively in the French Army. The United States Army didn't know what to do with this group of African-American National Guard units. Pershing had also promised the French a division of American soldiers, so very conveniently gave them over to the French Army. As a result, soldiers of the 93rd Division had a markedly different military and social experience than other American soldiers, both black and white. Despite being essentially discarded by the U.S. military, the 93rd Division was highly decorated and garnered widespread praise from their French comrades, many of whom actually came to prefer them over white American soldiers. The most famous regiment of the 93rd Division, and arguably the most famous regiment of black soldiers in the entire war, was the 369th Infantry Regiment, the former New York 15th National Guard, which after the war became known as the Harlem Hellfighters. The first African-American combat unit to reach France, the 369th, served for 191 consecutive days on the Western Front without losing any ground to the German army. Right? They also had a slam and jazz band. All right? The 369th Band, led by the renowned ragtime conductor James Reese Europe, contributed to the regiment's popularity and, along with other African-American military bands, helped introduce France to jazz, ushering in what would come to be known as the Jazz Age. The 369th was also popular for the remarkable heroics of two of its soldiers, Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson, who on the night of May the 13th, 1918, routed a 24-man German raiding party. Johnson, on the left there, using a combination of grenades, his bolo knife, these big, like 2-3 foot long knives that soldiers would carry along with them, as well as the butt of his rifle, single-handedly killed 4 Germans and wounded another dozen. This came to be known as the Battle of Henry Johnson, right, and was front-page news in newspapers throughout the United States, especially in the black press. The 2 men were the first American soldiers to receive the French Croix de Guerre with palm. Henry Johnson, quite belatedly, very recently, received the Medal of Honor, posthumously from President Obama. That's not exactly how things looked on the Western Front, so don't get it twisted, okay? What actually happened that night was much more gruesome, very sanitized portrayal there, right? But spoke to how both Needham Roberts and especially Henry Johnson were constructed as racial heroes, right? As symbols of African-American bravery, of African-American heroism, right? This is what African-Americans back at home were hungrily waiting for, the perfect incident to shape a historical memory of black participation in the war around the themes of bravery, heroism, manhood, and sacrifice. Indeed, how could anyone deny that as epitomized by Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, African Americans were not only heroic, but also worthy of first-class citizenship? Well, it would not be quite so simple. Memories of the 369th and other memories have, and in some ways continue to engage in a struggle with an alternate memory of the alleged failure of black combat soldiers and officers. Again, the 92nd Division was at the center of the storm, especially its black officers, who were the main targets of racist white military officials. The division's own white commanders labeled black officers as, quote, worthless, inefficient, untrustworthy, and cowardly, among other insults. General Robert Lee Bullard, named after that Robert Lee, who commanded the American Expeditionary Force's Second Army, wrote off the 92nd Division altogether, labeling it a misguided experiment, and would characterize it in his post-war memoir this way, quote, "The Negro Division seems, in a fair way, to be a failure." He would go on to further state that, quote, "Altogether, my memories of the 92nd Negro Division are a nightmare. If you need combat soldiers, and especially if you need them in a hurry, don't put your time upon Negroes." As his comment reflects, the accusations levied by hostile white officers quickly became about much more than just the conduct of one division or even one particular regiment in the 92nd Division, but why all black combat soldiers and officers were failures, and why they should not be used in a subsequent war. And these charges had a devastating effect, and in fact continues to inform assessments of black soldiers by some historians today. The assumption still exists that African Americans in some way didn't care about their history and attacks on their legacy. This was simply not true. African Americans, soldiers, and civilians engaged in a vigorous effort to not only redeem the memory of black service in France, but to shape it on their terms, to refute the characterizations by Bullard and others. This began immediately after the November 1918 armistice. Black communities welcomed their soldiers home with parades and festivities throughout the country, ranging from small local gatherings to massive processions like this that took place in New York City, welcoming the 369th Infantry Harlem Hellfighters back home. The black press and political leaders hailed the service of black troops as an unqualified success and eagerly anticipated the post-war era becoming a new reconstruction akin to the momentous transformations in the social, political, and economic status of African Americans following the Civil War. A host of black novelists, playwrights, poets of what would come to be known as the Harlem Renaissance produced a broad range of works that invoked the recent war or even had black servicemen as central characters in their works. Several black intellectuals, most notably W.E.B. Du Bois, also attempted to enshrine the contributions of black soldiers into the quote-unquote official written history. And a handful of African-American veterans published memoirs of their individual and regimental exploits, testaments to their historical awareness and self-conscious desire to both preserve and share their experiences. Together, these acts created a triumphant communal public memory of black service in the war that would be passed down from generation to generation. But other memories existed as well, and without question, not all of them were positive. African Americans also remembered the virulence of white supremacy and the racial discrimination endured by black soldiers during war. Indeed, the hypocrisy of American democracy that they had to grapple with during the war. One disgruntled veteran wrote in a letter following his discharge, quote, "We were treated like dogs. I mean, worse than German prisoners. I would die before I would undertake to go through what I have gone through." Moreover, historical memories of black military service were shaped as much by events of the post-war period as by the war itself. Black soldiers, quite literally, returned home from one war and entered another. W.B. Du Bois was not being completely literal, not being completely figurative, I should say, when he penned his famous May 1919 crisis editorial, Returning Soldiers, in which he declared, we return from fighting, we return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States or know the reason why. And this turned out to be the case. And it was by necessity because many white racists, both North and South, were ready to fight as well. Racial violence exploded throughout the country, much of it involving African-American veterans and white people resistant to any changes, both real and perceived, in the racial status quo. In the South, and really throughout the country, the number of black people lynched skyrocketed to 76. This lynching actually took place in Omaha, Nebraska. At least 11 returned black servicemen lost their lives to Southern vigilante racial violence. Race riots erupted in cities, both large and small, the most explosive taking place in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago. 38 people died in the Chicago race riot, where, and this is very important, black people led by returned African-American soldiers gave as good as they took. Black people after the war fought back. This was not a repetition of East St. Louis. This spoke to a new spirit of resistance and self-confidence inspired by the war. But without question, what James Weldon Johnson, famous African-American civil rights activist, poet, diplomat, what he would characterize as the Red Summer of 1919, left a deep scar in the psyches of many African Americans and shaped their memory of the war as one of dashed expectations. As one black veteran of the 93rd Division wrote in a letter after the Chicago race riot, quote, "Try to imagine the smoldering hatred within the breast of an overseas veteran who is set upon and mercilessly beaten by a gang of young hoodlums simply because he is colored." Many African Americans translated this smoldering hatred and the raw memories of democracy denied into organized protest. African American veterans, both physically and symbolically, shaped the upsurge in black radicalism and racial militancy that came to be known as the New Negro Movement. Organizations such as the African Blood Brotherhood, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey, as well as less-known groups, such as the veteran-led Lead for Democracy, provided highly politicized former soldiers with vehicles to translate their frustrations into movements of national and international change. So what do we make of this history? What do we make of the legacy of the war for African Americans and for the larger world? By the late 1920s, as racial conditions in the United States and beyond showed no signs of improving, W.B. Du Bois would adopt a very harsh view of the war, going so far as to describe it, quote, as a scourge, an evil, a retrogression to barbarism, a waste, a wholesale murder. These are his words by the mid-1920s. And perhaps Du Bois was right. Perhaps the war is all of these things. But Du Bois also acknowledged that the war and the experience of black soldiers marked a crucial moment in a longer history and struggle for racial justice. Historians often point to World War II as the incubus of the modern civil rights movement. I would argue that we need to go back even further and certainly acknowledge how the memory of the First World War informed the activism of black people during the Second World War and beyond. So I could certainly point to many examples, one of my favorite being Charles Hamilton Houston, who served as an officer in World War I and emerged from his experiences highly embittered, decided that he would never be caught off guard again without knowing what his rights were, used that disillusionment, that frustration to go to law school, went to Harvard Law School. Right? We become dean of Howard University's law school. We become the architect of the NAACP's strategy to dismantle Jim Crow segregation, right, through the Legal Defense Fund. Fought against racial segregation and discrimination in World War II, right, so that his experiences in the Army would not be repeated. So, in thinking about someone like Charles Hamilton Houston, right, thinking about a long civil rights movement, right, perhaps we should point to the experiences of African American soldiers and the era of the First World War as the pivotal moment of the 20th century when Black people began to confront the meaning of modern American democracy and their place in the nation as full and equal citizens. So we certainly owe a great deal to men such as Charles Hamilton Houston and the thousands of other African-American soldiers, not as famous as he, who fought and labored in World War I. They must occupy a central role in our commemoration of the war. Their contributions on and off the battlefield, their struggles, personal and collective, their victories and defeats, at home and abroad, are a vital part of the larger story of World War I. Moreover, this part of our history tells us a great deal about the meaning of democracy itself, what it has been and what it still must become. We are at a critical moment, I believe, in our country's racial history, whether on a street corner in Staten Island, a church in Charleston, South Carolina, or the campus of the University of Missouri. Continued physical and psychic assaults on the lives of Black people call into question just what type of country, what type of democracy we are living in. Indeed, just as African Americans like W.B. Du Bois asked a century ago, how can we expect to be the global model of freedom, equal justice, and democracy? When these ideals cannot be met at home, we must demand answers to these questions now. The memory of African American soldiers in the First World War reminds us that democracy, both practiced and preached by the United States, has been fraught with painful and at times explosive tensions. The memory of African American soldiers in the First World War reminds us that Black lives have and will continue to matter. The memory of African American soldiers in the First World War reminds us that democracy has and must continue to be something worth fighting for and even dying for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad. It was, a stimulating discussion, very similar to your book, changes the way that we think about and should think about the war, and in particular, African Americans' participation in that era. And I think you make a compelling argument about kind of the seeds of growing into that, what comes out of the 1930s and ultimately World War II. Question that I have is thinking, we both like Du Bois, and you keep returning to Du Bois. And when the war starts, he sees it as a positive good initially, because he sees it as a way that it's going to obliterate white supremacy throughout the world. That this will be a way, that maybe white supremacy will die. And by the end of the war, he sees that white supremacy globally has hung on, despite what happened, right? Despite the fact
and
that
strengthened in some ways.
Strengthened, absolutely. And so how does that inform Du Bois's process when he's reflecting back on "We Return Fighting"? Mm-hmm. The fact that what he declares at the origins of the war is white supremacy we will go to Europe, we will end white supremacy there, and it will end white supremacy in America. And then he sees a bloody return to America. And how does that inform the way he moves forward from there?
Right. He's initially angry. He feels deceived by his country, by Woodrow Wilson, but also by other African Americans who were working with the government at the time, promoting the war effort. He feels disillusioned. Certainly you see that in many of his immediate post-war writings. You could look at a book like Dark Water, which he published in 1920, as reflecting his profound disillusionment with American democracy and the immediate legacies of the war. He goes on to be deeply ashamed of his position in supporting the war, recognizing that closing ranks and forgetting our special grievances was ultimately an insufficient approach to take, and that he was wrong in supporting a war that ultimately made the world worse, in his view, certainly by the mid-1920s. He would also be very confused about the legacy of the war and his own personal place in it as well. How did he get this wrong, right? I mean, if any of you have read or studied Du Bois, right, Du Bois never admitted that he was wrong about anything, right? He was always the smartest guy in the room. And that's why his ego was about as big as this room also. He was genuinely confused about what the war meant. And that confusion really lasted until the end of his life. So I think this really very powerfully speaks to how even someone like Du Bois, kind of unquestionably recognized as one of the greatest intellectuals, regardless of race, in this country's history, could be so conflicted about the legacies of the war. Right? It really speaks to how, especially in the case of African Americans, the history of the war is still very conflicting, very confusing, and still being fought over in many ways. Right? That struggle for trying to create some type of positive memory around the war and Black participation in it is still certainly ongoing. Right? And I think part of what I try and recognize, in my work is that there is certainly an element of tragedy here that we have to reckon with, and how that gets expressed in different ways is part of the story that I think we need to tell.
It's a little awkwardly placed. Thank you very much. You spoke a little bit about African American soldiers in the regiments in France, but I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about those who stayed behind after the war. Mm-hmm. I believe in Germany some were positioned, and certainly I know this happened after the Second World War, mm-hmm. And how that went, and then maybe returning back to America after that.
Right. So you do have the beginnings of what would eventually become a very robust African American expatriate community immediately after World War I. It starts off very small. I mean, you really only have maybe a couple dozen African American soldiers who are able to stay in France after the war through various means. Some are able to attend French universities, others kind of slip through the cracks and stay there through other clandestine means. But I think what's really interesting about the fact that you do have a very small number of Black soldiers staying in France immediately after the war is that the United States Army prioritized sending African American troops, especially the African American combat divisions, back to the United States as soon as possible. Right? They were the first American troops to be sent back to the United States because they were concerned about what would happen if you have Black soldiers with all this free time on their hands after the armistice interacting with the French civilian population, right? And these fears of rape, right? This trope that served as, in some ways, the foundation for Southern racial violence and lynching in the South being transported across the Atlantic to France, right? And shaping how Black soldiers are being viewed and the policies that are being shaped around them. Okay, so on Pershing's orders, right, in consultation with French military officials, prioritize sending Black combat troops back to the United States as soon as possible. Right? So that's one of the reasons why you have such a small number. But without question, the core of that expatriate community, consisting of African American veterans, would shape a very culturally, politically dynamic community of African Americans and other peoples of African descent in Paris, in London, certainly, and would really kind of mark the beginnings of a transatlantic dialogue for racial justice, democracy, promoting positive images of blackness that would kind of define the social, political, and cultural movements of the 1920s and 30s.
Let me join the chorus of people thanking you for your talk. Thanks for coming in for your talk. So I feel obliged to ask a question about Ernest Hemingway, and to see if maybe, and feel free to say, you know what, I'm not interested in talking about that, and I'll have another question for you. But I'm just sort of curious if you're interested, or you see any ways that you can put into conversation the themes that you've talked about, and maybe the themes in that work. And here's what I'm thinking. Not being a specialist of this period, and not being a specialist on Hemingway, but it seems to me that despite all the horror of this war in terms of what black troops and black civilians experience, that the war, the dynamics around the war, does seem to politically energize black America. Mm-hmm. Whereas, as I at least think about the tone in Hemingway's work, right, that there's a weariness there, right, maybe even a cynicism. And so, it seems that the outcomes of the war, and let me know if I'm on a limb here, mm-hmm. that you see black communities energized, but you see a generation of white Americans.
Lost generation.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's sort of the term, who in some ways, again, it could be a stretch, who seem to be defeated in some ways so maybe that's not right, but I'm just sort of interested if there's anything that, if you want to take up any part of that. Yeah.
Well, I think that you certainly have many white veterans who come back from the war, who are politicized in various ways, who get involved in different political organizations, some of them, being quite radical, whether we're talking about socialists, the Communist Party. We could, point to the Bonus Army March, the struggle for benefits and recognition in that context. So I think in some ways this kind of trope of the lost generation overshadows that history of interwar radicalism. But you certainly do see how the war, I think in unique ways, politicizes, but also just broadens the racial and political and social consciousness of African Americans in, as I said, very unique ways. How many African Americans do indeed become involved in a whole range of different political organizations, some of them being quite radical, others, being more, mainstream, like the NAACP, which sees its membership, really increase significantly after the war. But you also see African Americans kind of asserting their newfound self-awareness in ways that are much more subtle, right, on the everyday level, right? Whether it's just wearing your military uniform, when you return back to the South, something that could quite literally cost you your life, right? Whether it's, refusing to get off the sidewalk when, a white person is walking, right? Which could also cost you your life. Whether it's, refusing to submit, to a mob in Chicago, protecting your home and your family. So these various acts, I think, speak to how we need to, consider the changes that happen amongst African Americans and black soldiers in particular in ways that were oftentimes quite dramatic, but also very subtle as well. And just in terms of the cultural memory, you certainly have different expressions of what the war meant. For African Americans in the realm of poetry, novels, artwork. Someone like Horace Pippin, for example, right, who was a veteran of the war, served in the 369th, was severely injured, almost lost complete use of his right arm, kind of willed himself to become one of the great modern artists in this country's history. You look at his artwork, a lot of it is carrying those same themes of disillusionment, of pain, of suffering. So I think we see how black soldiers were very human in that regard as well, right? In grappling with those type of issues. So,
So Chad, I'm thinking about how the Army used these soldiers during the war, and it is almost exactly the same way that the Union Army used black troops during the Civil War, and probably in about the same ratio. In the meantime, after the Civil War, you have the Buffalo Soldiers, who are widely recognized as being excellent at what they do. When they start bringing in significant numbers of black troops to fight into the Army to fight World War I, was there any discussion, explicit discussion of using the Civil War as a model for how to use African American men in uniform? Or is this just sort of the way it fell out?
no, I mean, they're certainly drawing on some precedents there. The idea that black soldiers needed to be commanded by white officers was certainly something that was drawn directly from the Civil War and really throughout kind of the post-Civil War period in terms of the experience of the Buffalo soldiers. A lot of the kind of pseudo-racial science, right? The idea that black soldiers, were inherently suited to certain types of duties, particularly as laborers, were, more ideally suited to serve in particular climates. All of these things, still continue to affect the so-called racial logic during World War I. You certainly do see kind of a modernizing of some of these racial ideas in the context of the First World War. Very interesting in the case of the Buffalo Soldiers. I mean, you have 10,000 African Americans who are serving in the regular army on the eve of American entry into World War I. The United States Army makes the decision not to use them, even though these were the first troops who were activated. First white troops that were brought into the American Expeditionary Forces. The Army feared using these seasoned black soldiers for combat in the Western Front as a potential source of racial unrest. So instead of employing them in combat, they had them stationed in the Southwest, in the Pacific. So one of the things I'm really interested in this work is this idea of military efficiency, right? How the Army saw racial segregation and all of these different policies that they were creating, which created a really chaotic situation, as being the most efficient way to wage war and to mobilize an army. I mean, yeah, it seems ridiculous now, right? But this was the logic, and I think we have to really grapple with how seriously, Newton Baker and these other folks were taking this, right? Military efficiency, right? Deemed that black troops had to be strictly segregated from white troops, right? That they had to serve in certain capacities, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, certainly some lineages that were being drawn from the Civil War, but also kind of particular to the unique circumstances of the First World War itself.